interesting when we were passing those reform and putting some limits in. The attorneys assured us that we just destroyed the whole legal profession. But I haven't seen any of them going out of business. I've seen an awful lot of them on TV advertising for more business. So they're not doing bad, even though they have some cap limits on what they can or cannot do. And that's what we're faced with every day, you know, the two sides of every issue. And what do you do about public education? How do you know, we mandate that you have to have certain qualified instructors to teach certain math courses. And using Morton, Texas as an example, it costs more per capita to teach algebra at Martin than it does at Plano. Because in Plano, they put 21 students in each class. They have the same qualified instructor that Morton has to have at the same pay level and to some extent. And if you ever go to per capita basis of funding for these schools in West Texas, they're all going to fold up. I mean, they'll be shut down. And if you do that, where does the poor country kid get his basic education so he can move into this world of technology that we live in? So there's a lot of contrast.
So Reverend Dotz, you've had years to consider this. What's a direction that brings some return to where you believe maybe we need to be?
Well, look, I have to try to frame it, and it appears to me that what we face is the huge gap between ought and is. Like the federal government stands much, or should stand, for what is ought, any politician, what ought to be for the common good. That's ought. Then we have a huge life where it is, and there's a vast gap. So sometimes we get lost in fussing about the shortfall of is, or we'll blame it on the folks charged to stand for what ought. Like, I think, Delwin, as a politician, you're charged to do what's for the common good, the humane common good of this country. We're stuck in a system, our medical system, in an is that is a long way from the ought. And so politicians, like the rest of us, have to work hard. But we do it under the sense we have this gap between the ought and the is, but that does not erase the fact that there is an ought. We exist to be humane, to serve the common good. And because our is entirely messed up, puts us to work there, but we don't lose sight of the ought. And that's one that I think it gets dangerous, because people can see so much wrong with the is, and then they often come up with quick solutions that don't take into account your word complexity. And I do think having a good ought helps guide the work on the is. Without it, we just get embroiled in name calling and labeling and short-sightedness.
Isabelle?
One of the things that strikes me about this gap between the ought and the is, as Reverend Dotz was speaking, is that it's such a huge and complex problem. And when I'm faced with a huge and complex problem of my own, what do? Do I try to just solve the whole thing in one big fell swoop? And usually that doesn't work for me. I write down step by step of how I can get from what is to what ought. And maybe that's one of the things that we could take away and communicate with our federal representatives, that if it's such a huge complexity, maybe we need to work on it just as I would work on getting from here to there, a step at a time. and seeing what we can do without taking on a huge debt that is so big that I, as a somewhat educated person, have no measuring stick with which to appreciate this. You can kind of get your arms around $1 million. You can kind of get your arms around, with a little stretch, $1 billion. But $1 trillion is so much that maybe we need to step back and start looking at these things a step at a time to see what we can do to make things better and get a step closer to ought from what is. It doesn't make sense to me to throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak, and try to do a whole big reform all at once. Because what are we going to have? We're going to have a huge debt, undoubtedly. And who knows if it's going to work or not without dumping it onto the state and having all of the funding having to come from the state then, when we can't do that either. But there are some things that we can make a big improvement doing that would maybe not be such a big bundle to dump onto the states and to dump onto our children, and our children's children are going a step at a time. Mm-hmm. Maybe we can take 2 or 3 steps at once, but maybe not this whole big thing. That's not how any of us as individuals solve our problems. We do things a step at a time, logically.
Do you have any sense of steps that you see that you think would be in the direction of what you just heard, Dad?
Yes, I really do. I don't think anybody talking about the big problem as far as health reform, I don't think there's hardly anybody that wouldn't say that health reform needs to be reformed. There changes need to be made. There's a lot of things that we're doing now that we could take one at a time and see what this would do without just completely changing all our system around. And that's what I think would be the best way to go in this situation, is not to try to do it all at once, but the Democrats, the Independents, the Republicans, every person in the United States could very well have something to contribute to say, well, let's try this first and see what that happens. For example, it has been brought up that there's so much graft and so forth in the present system we have. Well, that's good. Let's go ahead and clear that up now. Why wait until we throw everything out and then start over again, which will only evolve new ways of doing graft things and so forth. So I think that we probably have a lot of different things we can do. For example, the burden that you're going to put on the medical system, just talking about the doctors now. There's a lot of young doctors that have stopped going to medical school, or at least some, certainly many that never did go to medical school because of the fact they found out that it wasn't exactly what they wanted to do, and doctors are nothing if they're not independent. That's why one of the reasons I went into medicine is because I wanted to be my own boss. I wanted to be independent. I want to make my own decisions. And yet I'm getting so many restrictions on me when I was in active practice that it was very difficult for me to do the things that I wanted to do that I thought was best. For example, he mentioned tort reform. It seems, well, why in the world would a doctor do a bunch of unnecessary tests? Most doctors do not. But the tests are so expensive now. And in tort reform, if you don't do everything that anyone might suggest that you ought not to do or ought to do, then you're going to find if you get sued, then some lawyer is going to come up to you and say, well, did you think about doing this test in order to make the final diagnosis? And I would say, well, it didn't occur that that was the right thing for me to do or necessary for me to do at the stage we were at. But that doesn't make any difference because you've got people who are going to judge you. And if a doctor gets one malpractice suit, it possibly could be enough to take all the savings he's made in his entire life. There was one of the highest suits was a suit that was